Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Thank you for joining us. My name is Birte Snilstveit, and I'm the Director for Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE and Head of the London office. I'm also an editor of the International Development Group of the Campbell Collaboration. It's my great pleasure to be chairing this session on evidence gap maps. This is actually the third panel that we are hosting on evidence gap maps as part of the What Works Global Summit. And it's been really exciting to see the evolution, innovation, and adoption of evidence gap maps across sectors over the last decade or so, since we first started experimenting with the first prototypes of evidence gap maps at 3IE. Originally, we wanted a tool that could help us to strategically target gaps for research, impact evaluation gaps, and synthesis gaps, and also a way to present systematic review, collections of systematic reviews from our database. But we keep seeing new uses of evidence gap maps beyond what we ever imagined. An example that really stands out to me is that of the adaptation of the approach to inform policy discussions around human settlements in South Africa, which was shared by colleagues from DPME at the What Works Global Summit in 2016. In this case, a key function of the evidence gap map was to bring stakeholders together around a discussion on key policy priorities when developing the framework. This was a type of use that we hadn't envisaged, but it's actually a type of use that is turning into a key function of the approach. We'd like to hear about so this is to the audience, we'd like to hear about any evidence gap maps that you are working on, either as a doer or a user or a commissioner. So tell us what your EGM is about and how it is or will be used, either by using the chat function or by tweeting it at 3IE News using the conference hashtag of evidence for development. We've got an excellent panel lined up today who will share their experiences, lessons, challenges, and innovations as users and producers of EGMs. Each panelist will offer a short introduction before we'll move into a panel discussion and a Q&A session. This includes an opportunity for the audience to pose questions to the panel. And so for that, I'll ask you to use the Q&A function. So any questions that you'd like to be put to the panel, please put that in the Q&A. And use the chat function for any general chatter, comments, and if you would like to introduce yourself. So with that, I'll just go through the running order, and then I'll hand over to the first panelist. So we'll start with perspectives of two bilateral agencies, where we'll have Matthew Baker, who's a senior learning advisor at the USAID Organizational Learning and Research Division. We'll then have Rike Riesmeier, who's an advisor at the GIZ Knowledge for Nutrition program. This will be followed by Charlotte Lane, who's a senior evaluation specialist at 3IE, who will offer a researcher or a producer perspective. This will then be followed by Milena Reinfeld, Senior Evaluator of the European Investment Bank Evaluation Function. And finally, we'll hear from Harsha Dayal, who is Director of Research at DPME in South Africa, and who has pioneered the use of evidence maps for informing national policy planning processes. So I'm really looking forward to this session, and with that, I'm handing over to Matthew.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and I'm just going to walk through a couple of slides here. So I'm just going to situate the evidence gap maps that we at USAID and the DRG Center have been working on over the past 12 months or so. And I'm going to situate them in a suite of sort of related evidence and learning products that we have been developing. And it's something which is aiming to organize some of the core reference, what we'd like to think of some of the core reference materials to inform program design in the DRG space. And we've kind of titled it nominally at this point, the Learning, Evidence and Analysis Platform. And what that is a set of technical approaches, a set of metrics, both at the country level and at the programmatic level, and then finally a set of curated evidence. And just to unpack that a little bit, when I'm talking about the DRG sector, I'm talking about 6 distinct subsectors, which are contained in the F framework from the US State Department, the Foreign Assistance Framework, and that includes the rule of law, independent media, civil society, human rights, elections and political parties, and governance. And so for each of those 3 components, we have produced a set of related resources for each of these 6 subsectors. So just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, here is the rule of law technical approaches inventory, which is a set of basically areas of work that USAID does in the DRG space in under those 6 subsectors. And we engaged with a sort of bottom-up approach using document review from programmatic documents to extract approaches, and then workshopping those with each of the technical teams before offering the opportunity of both internal and external feedback to produce the final set of approaches. And I'm going to revisit the approaches in a second with regards to the evidence gap maps. The other thing I'll just quickly touch on is the set of metrics. So this comprises of both what we see here, a set of third-party metrics compiled to understand the context of particular countries. We've produced a set of data portraits which help sort of summarize and synthesize those things. And then relatedly, there are a set of outcome level indicators, which again are for each of the subsectors. So finally, evidence gap maps. So we have commissioned 6 evidence gap maps for each of those sectors. And we used the technical approaches inventories that I mentioned just a moment ago to help inform the intervention and outcome frameworks. And so that was a starting point for the development of these evidence gap maps. We currently have 4 of the 6 that we've commissioned completed. And just to give you a sense of the process, we began with that initial set of technical approaches, which were then workshopped with 3IE support and with the requisite technical teams to produce the draft intervention and outcome frameworks. Along the way, we sought feedback from an advisory group to help make sure that we had some external validation of what they looked like. And then following the development of the maps, we then had a set of feedback around a number of the user-centered design elements of an evidence gap map. So with regards to both the filtering that are involved, or which filters, and how they should be represented in the evidence gap maps. And so we currently, as I mentioned, have 4 of these 6. I'm going to preview a couple of things which we can dive into in further detail when we get to the panel conversations, but a couple of adaptations to Birte's point, introducing the session. A couple of them that I think are useful. First, we have sought to integrate not just high quality quantitative research approaches in the evidence gap maps, but also high quality qualitative research approaches. Those approaches are ones which touch on causal inference, and they include approaches such as realist evaluation, outcome harvesting, and process tracing. And so that is obviously an additional element that basically complements a lot of what is traditionally visualized in an evidence gap map. And we can talk about that in more detail as we go ahead. And the second element I'll just mention is accompanying these evidence gap maps, we are producing a user guide to help folks navigate and understand how to best utilize the EGMs, as well as an accompanying set for each of the 6 evidence gap maps, a set of practitioner briefings. And these will touch on topics of interest to the sort of core users within USAID to understand and distill basically the sort of high level, both what's present in terms of evidence, but also what is not present and what might need further work. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to Birte for the next panelist. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew, and for keeping well to time. Rike, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me here, and I'm very happy to be part of this group discussing EGMs and their use. Yeah, perhaps to start, a few words on my personal background. I mean, Birte already mentioned that I work as nutrition advisor for Knowledge for Nutrition, which is a program funded by and supporting the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, and also the European Commission. And the program aims to support better decision-making, policy and program design in the field of nutrition by making evidence better accessible and available. So yeah, how did we come to support our commission actually 3IE with creating an EGM? As for the background, as you are probably aware, the problem of malnutrition is worsening. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrown us off course, but even before the pandemic, reaching SDG 2, the zero hunger goal, seemed difficult to achieve, and at present seems even more out of reach. So in the competition for resources for nutrition, providing our decision makers with strong evidence of intervention effects helps us to make a good case and mobilize these much needed funds. In the field of food systems and nutrition, there's also the circumstance that there is a wealth of knowledge from studies available, but this is very difficult to navigate because of the sheer volume. So our EGM, Food Systems and Nutrition EGM, has been very helpful on the one hand to visualize the evidence that is available and making the evidence more easily accessible. So not such a strong focus here on the evidence gaps as Birte mentioned in her introduction, but really on helping to gather and visualize the available evidence. And this could be used, for instance, already by one of the larger GIZ nutrition programs in India in the redesign and selection of interventions in their new programming cycle to really root their intervention outcome framework in the best available evidence. What was also particularly interesting to us but then also the evidence gaps that were highlighted. This was, for instance, also a synthesis gap of evidence of interventions implemented at national level. Based on the EGM and then also with regard to the situation and needs of BMZ partner countries, we selected some interventions for evidence synthesis to fill identified gaps. And this is a project that we are currently working with 3IE at the moment that directly resulted from the EGM. The results from this will be used in our daily advisory work for BMZ and the European Commission, strategic decisions, but then also on GIZ partner country level in the day-to-day advisory work with partner governments. And I think I stop here and hand back over to Birte. And I look forward to hearing from the other participants and the discussion.
Thanks, Rike. And over to Charlotte.
Hey, yeah, so I am Charlotte Lane. I'm a senior evaluation specialist at 3IE, and I have worked on the projects with both Matt and Rike. So it's very interesting to hear your perspectives on this. But as the person leading the technical side on some of this work, working with USAID and GIZ to think about the evidence gap maps, how they would be used, and to adapt them for certain known limitations of those EGMs has been really interesting to hear USAID and GIZ and others sort of push us to overcome some of those challenges and make these maps more useful and innovative. So I thought I would choose one example from each of the work and just briefly talk on how we're making those changes within our EGMs, even as we have a well-established approach. So first, thinking about the food systems EGM with GIZ, this was a really interesting project for me. I have a background in nutrition, and the issue of food systems, as Rike said, it's this large topic that's very difficult for people to get their heads around, and just defining the food system took us a couple of months, I think. And we also have this big body of literature that is expanding very quickly at the moment. There has been a big push from some initiatives out of the UN to get a lot more publications in the next year or two. And one of the big concerns that GIZ had was about how this could become out of date very quickly. This is a pretty common criticism of EGMs is, it takes us a year to make them, and in that time, they have already become out. So we have been working with Rike and GIZ and done a lot of work internally to think about how we can address that criticism and make sure it doesn't happen. So we expect to have our first living EGM updated at the end of the year in December. And so this will be an interesting new process for 3IE, but also to my knowledge, it's the first time that we're going to have any sort of regular cycle where you do the search, screen, data extraction, update, and you just keep that going for an extended period of time. And that really does add to the utility of these. Folks who are looking to use it as a database, as an easy reference, need to know that it has the information that is actually relevant to them and up to date. And when GIZ said that that was one of the big purposes that they want to use this for as a tool in their program design, we wanted to respond to that and make sure that it stayed up to date. So this is a exciting new development that we have to address that challenge. And then also with USAID and the DRG Center, Matt talked about it briefly, but we did have an issue with the types of evidence that are normally included in evidence gap maps. So traditionally, our EGMs are limited to quantitative impact evaluations and systematic reviews of impact evaluations, but that's hard in the context of democracy and human rights. There's potentially less room for quantification, and we immediately, upon engagement with USAID, we're getting this feedback of you're going to be missing a lot of really important information and really important evidence out there if you limit it to only quantitative work. So we had a lot of interesting discussions back and forth with USAID and some evaluation experts and internal discussions about what would a qualitative evaluation look like, what would qualify as causal attribution in qualitative work, and how could we then actually reflect that on an EGM from a very practical sort of back end aspect of this. What would the programming look like? And so we've been working to get that qualitative evaluations integrated into the EGM platform. And we are almost done getting those posted in the next couple of weeks or months. So it's really exciting to have this new addition of having that qualitative component in impact evaluations and being able to reflect a new type of evidence. So that's just sort of two ways that we have both been challenged, but then tried to accommodate and make these EGMs stronger. And I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Charlotte. So then I'll hand over to Milena to share some of your experiences with an EGM.
Hi, hello everybody, and thank you for having me on this panel. So as Birte said at the start, I'm a senior evaluator at the European Investment Bank. And maybe I'll just say a few sentences before I start talking about the evidence gap map of how we normally work to put it a little bit into context. So usually what we do is we focus on sector and thematic evaluations, where we use quite a sort of different set of methods, from project evaluations, case studies, literature reviews, surveys, and more recently also economic modeling. Late 2019, as the European Investment Bank was sort of positioning itself from being a bank that supports climate to becoming the EU climate bank, we decided that we were going to do a systematic review of a climate-related topic. And because we hadn't done a systematic review previously, we paired with 3IE, with Birte and her London team, to help us learn about systematic reviews and how to do them. And it was actually 3IE who then suggested to us that it would be useful for us not to go straight in and pick a topic for the systematic review, but to start off with an evidence gap map to really allow us to see what evidence is already out there, so that we wouldn't duplicate, but also to allow us to see that we've got enough evidence in the area that we then do a systematic review to really allow us to say something other than we don't yet have enough studies that we can kind of summarize. So that's how we got to doing our first evidence gap map. So for us, it was really having the evidence gap map was a stepping stone to get us to a systematic review. And we did focus in the end on energy efficiency for the evidence gap map. And what we found was that there were quite a lot of studies when it comes to building renovations and building upgrades, which is an area that the European Investment Bank is quite active in. So we kind of not explicitly, but implicitly mapped the areas of activity of the bank across the interventions that we had on the evidence gap map to then see where there was an overlap and where we had enough studies that we could then go ahead and synthesize. So in that way, it was really, really useful for us. And we saw from the evidence gap map immediately that, for public institutions and commercial sort of setups, industry, there was very little in terms of energy efficient building upgrades that we could synthesize, but there was quite a lot of evidence out there when it comes to residential buildings, and that's what we ended up working on in our systematic review. So we could already upfront focus the question to make sure it was going to be a question where there was evidence to allow us to answer that. What didn't work quite so well, and that's why I'm really interested to hear what the other people on the panel have to say, is it was useful for us in the evaluation division to have the evidence gap map. What we had done, because we always do it, and this was the first time we did this evidence gap map, we had set up a reference group from colleagues from our internal services to give us feedback on what we were doing to make sure it's actually useful. And they found the evidence gap map a little bit more difficult to deal with. They didn't really know what to make of it, to be honest. And I think that was partially down to the fact that it showed them the names of the studies, but it didn't actually tell them not even the headline sort of findings from these studies. It also didn't tell them whether the studies we had there were of good quality or not, because they were worried that where we had grey literature included, that some of the stuff that we had there may not have been peer reviewed and probably wouldn't be useful for them to look at. So it was a bit of a mixed experience for us, and I think we learned some useful lessons, which I'm happy to talk about. What we might want to do differently should we do this again. But I don't think that's for the intro, so maybe we can come back to that later on. So I'll just stop there and then see what questions come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena, for a honest account of your experience. So then I'll pass over to Harsha. So I think you're on mute. No, we can't hear you. If you go to the settings, perhaps. So Harsha, if you go to the settings and then check that the microphone is the correct one, and then click apply. I think because you dropped out for a bit, and then you might have to. So I'm wondering if we can get someone to help Harsha, and in the meantime, we might move on with a couple of questions for the panel. So I wonder if Rike, based on your experience with the EGM that you've just talked to us about, if you can offer your reflections on some of the main strengths and challenges of EGMs.
Yeah, sure. In terms of strengths, as I mentioned earlier, what was very helpful to us was to take a step back, so to say, take a broader view of the science on a specific topic, and have a good overview of the available evidence and studies. But this brings me to a few limitations that I wanted to speak about. Firstly, but I think this is also known to all participants, an EGM is not a panacea. So I think also, as Milena just raised, there's still time and resources needed to interpret the identified studies. So the work does not end with an EGM. It kind of begins there, or there still is work to be done after the creation of an EGM. My second point is then also related to the first, and relates to the quality of studies. So users of an EGM also need to examine the quality of studies that were identified. So in our case, some quality issues that were raised or that we faced included inappropriate study design or choice of outcome indicators of studies to make statements on intervention effectiveness. Some other issues were also, for instance, a lack of standardized outcome indicators, which made a comparison and synthesis of results difficult. This was especially related to diet quality measurements, but this also brought us back to taking this into our work on indicators, which we do in our program. So this was actually also quite helpful. And the third point that I wanted to mention, but this was also raised by Charlotte, that the process of mapping evidence is never finished. So after the completion of an EGM, I mean, there's still emerging evidence, new studies commissioned and published. And yeah, but this is why we decided together with 3IE to turn our EGM into a living document. And this is a process that we're currently working on. Yeah, handing back to you.
Thanks, Rike. And Harsha, do you want to try and come in? No. Perhaps then we can move on to...
Harsha is muted. She just has to unmute herself. Do you want to try that, Harsha? You have the option at the bottom to unmute yourself, or you should have it. Doesn't work? Okay. The only thing I can suggest other than that is try to re-log in, but using a Chrome browser, if you haven't done that. Sorry, back to you, Chair.
Thanks, Ramona. Milena, do you want to offer some of your... So actually, Harsha, I think you're now unmuted.
Am I
Yes.
unmuted? Can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes.
Sincere apologies, colleagues, and I'm so sorry for this hiccup because I've been unmuted and my video is on. So let me jump right in. And it was really great to hear of all the other experiences. And thank you, Birte. Birte is our trailblazer in this work. She trained us way back in 2015. And we had started on this journey of evidence mapping. But I think that, you know, being a researcher and working with 3IE, with other research projects, we spoke the same language. But when you enter the policy space, you start speaking a different language. And how can you join that area of being able to bring in credible evidence as well as work within the demand space. So I work as a director of research in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and that is an oversight department based in the presidency. I think that if we just consider this user perspective, that sometimes we know that as researchers or as those that are producing the evidence for uptake, that it always becomes a difficult one when you work in the demand space and don't really define what you are supposed to be working on. So basically, you work on the policy areas that you are given, right? So in 2015, 2016, we already realized that traditional forms of research, meaning that you take a research question and you process the information and you come up with findings and then bring in the stakeholders, are very difficult to bring, the idea of what body of work is available. So Birte mentioned upfront that when we were introduced to evidence gap maps, it was very clear that the value of mapping was more for us in the body of existing work, scope of what exists, as well as the identification of gaps. So we started with the human settlements work, and it was very clear that, you know, we wanted to know who are the players in the field, who's generating what evidence for what purpose. And the maps had to be reorientated and adapted from the original sense of having outcomes and interventions in that matrix format. That was certain, that was kept as in the structure, but the level at which we started to engage with. So the outcomes was very much at a national level for housing that had to be reflected at subnational level. Then we began to get success in engaging with that map, and how we started to find the other value is that it was defining what is evidence and what constitutes evidence. So in there was a lot of different stakeholders starting to say, but qualitative, and I know Matthew spoke about the qualitative part, and all of the colleagues here are starting to show the expansion of what is inclusive in the maps. And that became how we started to engage with more stakeholders, more demands, and across the sectors. So in 2015 was the human settlements. 2016 we started on state capacity in the political economy of developmental states. In 2017 we engaged with early grade mathematics. So mathematics as a core function of outputs for the next generation of the fourth industrial revolution, that you would call it. And we went into that space. Then the 2018 was the early grade maths one. 2019 was the land reform that was actually a request from the politicians, in a sense, because land reform was such a highly political arena. And there it became very clear that citizens' views and citizens' experience of land reform in South Africa was a huge factor. Then the last one was the last year we did it on health systems. And what it showed was that from map to map to map within our same environment, I think USAID or in 3IE, as an organization, you start to collect these resources. And what we found is that as knowledge resources for the public sector, it was very evident we wanted to bring it in. So, but what became quite evident for us is that the innovation was not just in the research process, but in how you engage with stakeholders and how you mobilize stakeholders behind each one of them and each one of the maps, and that it became an organizational resource for us as the intermediary working with policymakers as well as the researchers. And today we find that the value of the map lies in the actual data we extract out of each one of those maps. And that's when we started to link it to rapidly responding in the space of specific questions that get asked, but because we adapted it to become a policy relevant, which means a high level view of all the resources that we've collated and included, that we now can go back to those maps to be able to answer very specific questions in a very timely manner. And we know that it's with confidence and with credibility because the searching process has been completed and we can now engage with the policymakers directly. So the challenge is that, you know, we don't have everybody behind us in terms of showcasing the maps, but when we use the maps and when we respond timely, that's when the attention gets. Let me stop there and encourage some of the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Harsha. So to the audience, I would encourage you to put any questions that you have of the panel in using the Q&A function. I have some questions to the panel that I will put to you but we might throw some audience questions into the mix straight away because we're a little bit delayed because of technical issues. So I wonder if both Milena and Charlotte, if I can ask you to reflect a little bit on the strengths and challenges with EGMs, and perhaps Charlotte in particular, if you can also cover the question from Ramona about including studies only in English and how you might address this issue in EGMs. So perhaps Milena first.
Sure, and I can also say a few words on the language question because it was one of the questions that came up for our map as well. So I think for me, the challenge, one of the challenges was that I don't think we quite realised the amount of time producing an evidence gap map would take, and you know, partially that was down to agreeing on a topic and then finding the correct intervention outcome framework. That took longer than we had anticipated. But then also the way the search is done and the systematic and transparent manner, which of course is a strength, but it meant that, you know, the draft map, I think, took us roughly 6 months to see, and we simply hadn't anticipated that, because, as I said at the start, we were keen to have a systematic review. So it meant really that the whole process for us took longer than we had expected. Also, I've already mentioned the fact that the map, as we produced it, and that was partially down to the sort of resource issue, didn't include an assessment of the quality of the studies on the map. We assessed the systematic reviews, but not the primary research, and we also didn't have time or resources to, you know, give a line or two of the sort of headline findings of the study. So I think for us, those were the main challenges. We had a long discussion with our reference group, especially around the language issue of the studies that we had on the map, and also the same discussion came up again for the systematic review, where we found that most of the evidence on our map came from English-speaking countries. And as the European Investment Bank, obviously we work in a lot of the European countries, and there was, I think, no studies that were in German or in French or in you know, Polish or any of the other languages, which made our users doubt that the search was really inclusive, and I think the assumption we had was that most researchers would translate at least the abstract, and that we therefore would capture the abstract in the search, and would then be able to find the actual study. I don't know if Charlotte can say a bit more about that. I'm not sure we completely resolved it, and again, it came back a little bit to a resource issue for us. On the one hand, we wanted the evidence gap map relatively quickly, and on the other hand, we wanted a lot of things added on that would then take time and money to do. So it was a little bit tricky for us, especially being our first experience of doing an evidence gap map. Thanks.
Thanks, Milena.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have a couple of points, I guess, to cover, and starting first with the sort of easiest cut and dry one on language to me. This is a criticism that comes up fairly often about, you know, why would you only be including English? That's obviously sort of implicitly downweighting other types of evidence. At 3IE, we have access to folks that can look at a broad range of languages. And then it comes to the question of, is that what has been specified in our protocol? And is that what has been agreed on, you know, ahead of time? We generally only run our searches in English, but we don't need to be excluding based off of language. That's an inclusion criteria that people can decide what to value and if they want to value it or not. So I think that it is something that is taken case by case based off of the interests of the people that we're working with. Another thing that has come up from both Milena and Rike is this question of the quality of the evidence. And the issue of, okay, great, now, you know, the food systems EGM, I have 2,000 studies, which of these are any good? And that is something that we do get challenged on fairly often. Generally, that is not that is not something that we put within the scope of most of our EGMs. Our EGMs are meant to be collecting all of the available evidence, sort of agnostic about quality. And part of the reason for this is, what is quality? Who's defining quality? How do we define quality? This all becomes very subjective very quickly, and something that we sort of are consistently struggling with at an organization is that there's a certain camp of people that might say, well, RCTs are better quality than quasi-experimental. And maybe a good RCT is better than a bad quasi-experimental study, but that does not mean that all RCTs are better than all quasi-experimental studies. And I think that one thing that we are working on as an organization is thinking about how do we even determine and define quality before we can then place that into the hands of the user. So while eventually that might be a great future step in an EGM, at this point that is something that is really limited to systematic reviews and is something that we are hoping that the users will be able to do when they use it as a tool. That said, I do understand, again, with the food systems EGM, sometimes we will have over 100 studies in a single intervention outcome combination for that map, and providing users with another way to winnow down and select might be useful. And I think that that's where some of the filters that are perhaps by study design can get at some of this quality issue without going into a detailed quality appraisal, which is at this point not something that we think is within the realm of feasibility for a huge EGM that has 2,000 studies in it. I think there's also a limitation around this issue of telling you the results. EGMs don't do that. That is what systematic reviews are. With USAID, we are working on developing some sort of very rapid briefs based off of EGMs that can get some indication of the results, but that is a additional product after the EGM has been made. And actually, we're working on rapid evidence assessments with GIZ also based off of EGMs. So this is sort of the opportunity for building out. These are areas that we can build, thinking about telling results, thinking about doing quality appraisals. But currently within sort of how we envision EGMs at the moment, those are limitations that we're working on expanding and addressing.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. Then I wonder if Matthew and Harsha perhaps can reflect a bit further on in your experience, the different uses of EGMs. And if you could also incorporate in your responses the point made by Lawrence about the potential use of EGMs for organizational knowledge management and learning.
I can go real quick. Yeah, great questions. Thank you, Birte. So just thinking about utilization, as I mentioned, we've just kind of completed 4 of the 6. So many of the EGMs are, excuse me, are still in their early stages. But we've already seen with the rule of law evidence gap map, which has been the one that was developed first, that we've already seen some very different use of what's in it. Primarily, the development of a rule of law policy. So the EGM helped basically kind of provide an opportunity to develop that policy framework for sort of programmatic analysis and design based upon a sort of an approach that looks at the system, services, and society, these 3 different elements. And so that indeed is how the EGM is also similarly structured. So the process of developing the EGM actually helped provide an opportunity to think through what would be the most appropriate framework to basically employ in that policy. And then, of course, beyond the policy element, there has also been the ability to kind of leverage it in programmatic design. And that's something that's kind of an ongoing process. And that indeed is kind of the primary use case for which we see the evidence gap maps supporting, which is to say, providing an understanding of basically what evidence exists for the different programming options that a USAID staff member might be thinking about. And of course, in cases where there are gaps, that obviously suggests that maybe a different type of approach might be applicable or useful, as well as kind of thinking about maybe downstream, maybe that there is obviously a need that might need to be addressed. And so thinking about organizational learning from our perspective, the other kind of key element that the evidence gap maps help is they provide not just what's present, but what's not present. And we're using what's not present to inform strategic decisions around what learning questions we might have, which we kind of have a DRG learning agenda, which have a series of learning questions that we fund. So the evidence gap maps will be helping to inform the selection and so it's the identification, and then the sort of prioritization of which of those questions we might want to help fill out in terms of those evidence gaps. And so that's a process that we're now sort of embarking on as well. And that those obviously, the DRG learning agenda is kind of our sort of initiative-wide effort that both kind of looks to ask those questions as well as address them. And then beyond just addressing them, also support like utilization and uptake of findings. And so the idea is that the EGM has kind of become that a suite of products that kind of fits into that organizational model that we've been basically deploying. So thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Harsha?
Thanks. I think just hearing Matthew, it almost seems like you're also talking about our organization because it's very similar in terms of how we started to use. So beyond the research process, and I think other colleagues have shown the utility of the maps through the research process, and Lawrence has brought out this for us that became such an asset within our organization as a knowledge management tool, because what we started to do was not just have scientifically sourced and generated evidence, but also evidence that is important for the organization to report and to provide analysis and research around lessons that are critical to the managers and management information as well. So for us, the monitoring and evaluation kind of evidence that is in-house in our own generated reports, those become so important that we became we started to use our evidence maps as the organizing frame. And I think Charlotte or the other colleagues mentioned about framework setting and how the framework has to be more inclusive so that you start to identify the gaps from a broader perspective, right? But within that, we started to see that the maps could be used not just for reporting on the gaps for internal purposes, but to set a research agenda that we in government obviously can't generate this by ourselves, that in our partnerships with science councils and universities, that if we're talking across the sectors of housing versus education versus the economy versus health, that we can start identifying these gaps, because in policy space, if you include interventions that are included in the documents, but we don't have enough evidence of where it's working, for whom it's working, under what conditions. We started to generate that kind of evidence by communicating this is what's needed. So, you know, we don't then end up having to outsource every research project. Our aim is not to have maps that can become products of their own and inform a research or a systematic review on their own, but it's to become inclusive of much more needed research and knowledge management, knowledge agenda for priorities of us in government. So it became expansive in that sense, that the mapping platform and the mapping facility was an engagement tool with the variety of stakeholders that we started to use to mobilize behind the maps. So in the framework setting, it becomes important for us to say, all the different stakeholders are represented in that in that framework. But at the same time, when we generate the evidence and when we generate the evidence that exists, but how we synthesize in responding to specific research questions after that, the maps enable that. So basically, the inclusivity of the framework plus the types of evidence we use, it becomes a way of building consensus, because I think in any area of need, there's always diversity of views. There are always differing positions. There are always different starting points, and that's what we see from sector to sector. And the maps became an engagement tool for us to say, here's the evidence, here's the gaps, here's what we don't know enough of. Let's engage as a collective. So that became quite useful for us. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm conscious of time, but I wonder if Rike, if you can just say a few words. So Harsha was talking about some of the ways that they've engaged with stakeholders in their maps. Maybe you can talk a bit about how you've been doing that in your map.
Yeah, but I think Harsha covered that pretty well. I mean, I can only echo the sentiment that it's important to involve a variety of stakeholders, also from our side, expected users of the EGM, to really increase legitimacy, and then also, after all, utilization of the map. I mean, on the technical side, there was this technical expert group coordinated by 3IE, from participants from different sectors, different continents as well, to provide input. And then from our side, as a multi-donor program, we had we invited a broad range of stakeholders from the BMZ and the European Commission side, from the development sector, governmental, non-governmental, scientific community, donor representatives, to have regular update calls, but then also an opportunity for our stakeholders to provide their feedback. So this was very helpful, and I can only recommend, but Harsha outlined that pretty well as well.
Great, thank you. So I'm conscious of time, so we have a couple of minutes left, but I wonder if any of the panelists would like to, so that there are questions from the audience about any software and tools that can be used for the visual aspect of EGMs. And there's also a question about the best way to assess the quality of different EGMs.
Maybe I can jump in about the quality of EGMs, having worked on a couple at this point. From my point of view, a way to think about the quality of an EGM is somewhat similar to how you would think about the quality of the first portion of a systematic review. So in a systematic review, which folks might be a little bit more familiar with, the first portion is developing that search strategy and having a rigorous screening approach. And so one of the first things I would check is to make sure that they searched for what they said they searched for, and that their approach, didn't have the possibility for missing things. There's appropriate double screening where that makes sense, or safety first screening, that you can think about how data was extracted and really going through the mechanics of it to make sure that the data quality and extraction that's represented there is appropriate. But then the other thing that maybe is a little bit more of an art when it comes to EGMs is developing those frameworks. And if I'm looking at the quality of a EGM, one of the big things that I will look at is that framework, and to see if the framework is written in a way that could be consistently applied by all of the screeners and the coders that are using it. because one place where you can get some unintended challenges can be if different people are interpreting the framework differently. And so at 3IE, we have a pretty intensive training process on our frameworks before our screeners get off and going. But we do a lot of testing of those frameworks to make sure that they are exclusive and exhaustive, and that they can be consistently applied. So that would probably be the place that's more subjective than objective, but has quality implications.
Great.
Can I jump in quickly? I know time is this, but for us, I think in terms of quality, when you look at the rigor of what you included and the scientific process within it, those are per entry of included studies. But the overall map, the overall evidence gap map, if it's transparent and if it's systematic, those are the two criteria that I would go by, because if it's transparent, you will declare where you sourced, what you sourced, why you've excluded, and which stakeholders were involved and at what point. And if it's systematic, you will always update the map going back to its systematic approach. Those two present for us quality maps. That for me is a short answer. Thanks.
Thanks, Harsha. So I think a couple of key takeaways from my perspective. So I think it was Rike who mentioned that EGMs are not a silver bullet or something to that effect. I think this is a key takeaway message, and perhaps, you know, the distinction between what typically we do in an EGM and what typically we do in a systematic review. And I think related to that point, the importance of managing expectations of stakeholders. But I think at the same time, another key takeaway is, you know, that there is continued innovation and adaptation to respond to stakeholder needs. But that, of course, you know, within a project, there are scope and budget limitations. So those, it seems that it's important to communicate and agree on those points up front. And then just, you know, I think really exciting to hear about the ways that different organizations are making the tools their own, and putting demands on researchers for how to adapt and improve the usefulness of the EGMs. So with that, I'm looking forward to hopefully the fourth panel on EGMs at the next What Works Global Summit, where I'm sure that there will be lots of new innovations and examples of continued improvements. So thank you so much to the panelists in particular, and thanks to our audience for listening in and for your questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Much again.
Apologies.
No worries. Take care. Bye-bye.